Hey everybody, I'm Chef Tom with atbbq.com, and this is Kansas City brisket and burn-ins. That's right, today we are cooking up a brisket in the Kansas City style. And what does that mean? Well, from a flavor perspective, it means it's gonna be a little salty, a little sweet, and in the end, a little saucy. But when people think about Kansas City brisket, typically the first thing they think of is burnt ends. And that's why today we're gonna give that point muscle that produces the burnt ends a little extra attention. And we're gonna do that by separating it out from the flat. So we are cooking our brisket in two pieces today. And the main reason for that is we can give the burnt ends as much love and attention as they deserve. You're gonna get basically double the amount of bark on it, which means every single burnt end in the end is going to have smoke, it's going to have seasoning, and it's going to have texture. But we're not gonna forget about that flat. Obviously we gotta treat those slices right as well. That lean meat needs to be juicy. And when you separate it out in a whole brisket, you run the risk of drying it out a little bit. So today we're going to be injecting it with a briny, beefy liquid mixture that's going to add tons of flavor and tons of juiciness in the end. So let's get started by trimming out the brisket. We're starting here with a full prime brisket from Creekstone Farms. Now this thing has been in the fridge wet aging for about 40 days, and you can see it in the flexibility. If you picked this thing up 40 days ago, fresh off the line, it'd be kind of stiff as a board. But in that time, all these enzymes that are trapped in here, and it has to stay cryovac when you're wet aging. Leave that in the cryo, and those enzymes inside start to break down the meat and tenderize it. Now, if you go any longer than 40 days on a wet age, you might start to get a little smell on it, but this has no smell at all, no odor, which tells me it's absolutely safe to eat, and it's got that extra tenderness to it now. This process of separating out the two muscles that make up the whole brisket, the point that kind of wraps around the back and goes over the top, and the flat that sits underneath, it's kind of an intermediate move, but once you've done this a handful of times, you'll get a lot more comfortable at it. The thing that I find kind of helps to get things started is we're going to take just a little off the sides here to really expose where those muscles come together. We're also going to get rid of this kind of gray meat that's, maybe it's gone down the line, it's seen a little steam or seen a little something. And then in between the two, we should be able to get a good look at where these meet. So there's the line right there. That's your flat and that's your point. So I'm gonna do a little trimming on top of the point here. I don't necessarily think you need to take all of the fat off of this point, but any of this hard fat I'm gonna trim off. And in the process, that's gonna help me kind of find the line of where these two muscles come together. See, the point meat's got a lot of intramuscular fat, so you can trust that it's gonna be juicy and fatty no matter what. This flat that's the lean meat, we want to keep some fat on top of that though, because that really helps enhance the entire process of eating the lean meat when you've got that thin layer of fat right on top. So you can see this big wedge of fat that kind of runs in between the two muscles. If we trim that out just a little bit, you start to see right here, that's the edge of the point muscle where we're going to get our burn ends. And it's coming down, it's probably going to come across something like this. But what we can do is we can actually get the knife underneath there just a little bit. I gotta turn this so I can make the cut, but get your finger under it, and there's a very natural seam where this thing wants to separate, and you just wanna follow it. Make short little cuts, pull up on that muscle so that gravity's doing the work for you. And anything that you lose here, any little bit of this point meat that you cut off here accidentally or otherwise, don't worry about it. That's so thin, we're not even gonna end up eating that in the end. And once you've got all the way across, you found the far end of that point muscle, you're just gonna lift this up, making these cuts to these fibers that are connecting the muscle and the fat. You wanna stay in the white. If you see red, you need to head in a different direction because you're cutting into meat now. And again, you got the line on the side to kind of give you a guideline of where to cut. Fat tends to get a little bit harder at the far end here. But just keep following that seam. And then back at this back end is where the point wants to kind of wrap around and sit down, so you kind of have to start heading down a little bit. All right, so now you've got that point meat completely separated from the flat meat, and we can trim these independently. So when it comes to the fat, trimming the fat from the point here, I'm just taking off the really hard stuff. Anything like this piece here. Again, I don't mind if there's a little layer of fat on here, but we don't need the big, heavy, hard fat, big chunks of it, because as you can see, when you look at this, the actual muscle in here, there's tons of fat running all throughout it. So we're not going to be low on fat at all. So now that this is looking cleaned up pretty well on top, we're going to take a look kind of at this thin end. If there's nothing here that's going to be thick enough to constitute a burnt end, I'm just going to take it right off, because you're better off using this in your grind for your sausage or your hamburger or whatever. That way it actually gets utilized. It doesn't just get burned up on the smoker. Opposite side, this is what was once the top of the brisket. So again, hard fat comes off, a thin layer of soft fat is great. Now the thing about the point muscle here is it is really thin at one end and thicker at the other. So typically what I'll do, and this doesn't have a huge mound, but we can still benefit from this technique, is I'm gonna take my knife in here. We're gonna butterfly out the thick end of this. So you're just gonna try and make a very flat cut all the way to the thickest part, rolling that out all the way. And now we've got something that's very much more similar in height all the way across the board, which means when we go to cube this up, all of those burn ends are roughly the same size. So that's good to go now. Let's move that off to the side so we can trim up our flat or our lean meat. Now the first thing that can go here is this giant hunk of fat that you'll find on every brisket. Once you take that off, you'll see 100% fat. That you can chop down or grind up and then make some tallow out of it. And that goes for pretty much any of the fat you trim off of here. If you haven't yet, go check out our video on how to make your own beef tallow from brisket trimmings. It's one of those things that can be utilized for all kinds of things in cooking. Fat cap side of the lean now. You can see we've got a lot of extra fat here. We want to trim down to 1/4 inch. We've got a little bit of point meat that we cut off right there. We're going to get rid of that. If this helps you remember how it was sitting originally, it was a little bit more like this. So now that that is gone, we've got this trimmed up down to about 1/4 inch. We got to do the same thing with this side of the flat. You really want to be careful not to go any deeper than just that little bit of point meat that is left behind, so that we can keep a decent fat covering across the surface. That can be a little difficult in this particular spot just because that's where those muscles really get closest. But once you get past that, looking at it from the side, it's not hard to see what you need to shave down. We've got a nice even fat cap on this now. We've got a few strands of really thin point meat left here that I'm not going to mess with. I'd rather have the fat in between than dig all that out and expose all the meat. So at this point, what we're ready to do is start injecting the flat. So the injection mixture is going to start with 1 cup of water, or you could use beef stock. But instead of using beef stock today, I'm just going to use a tablespoon of beef base, which is really concentrated beef flavor. We'll also be adding a tablespoon of our Cattleman's Grill Butcher House brine, which is just a great brine base, salt, sugar, onion, garlic, all good things. And then we get that concentrated beef base flavor in there. It's gonna up the beefiness of an already very beefy cut of meat. We give this a good shake to break down all that beef base so we can get it into the injector. So I'm going to use this pistol grip injector. It's my favorite tool anytime I'm injecting, really, because it works quick and it's effective. Load it up. And then we're going to work our way through this brisket in a grid pattern so that we don't miss anything, injecting as much liquid as it will take, because it will let you know when it's had enough, but you can see it kind of plump up. And not all of this is going to stay in here right now. Not all of it's going to stay in there throughout the cook even, but by adding this extra moisture right now, you can bet that it's going to have extra moisture in the end. And I'm realizing I haven't talked about it yet, but you see the technique we're using here is you get in there, you poke around, create a little pocket for where that liquid can sit, and then give it the pump. All right, so I'm going to use some of this excess liquid on the board here as a binder for both the flat and the point. The point is not getting injected. It doesn't need to be injected. It's got plenty of fat. It's going to be plenty moist. And now that those are kind of coated in a very thin layer of liquid, we're going to hit them with our seasoning. So today we're starting with Plowboy's Bovine Bold. This is a Kansas City brisket rub, and a fantastic one at that. It's got just a touch of sweetness. Of course, it's got the salt. You see some of that color. You'll get some celery seed in here as well. It's a nice thin consistency that really attaches to the meat well. But this first rub is only going to complement what we're using for our second rub, which is the Yoder Smokers beef rub. And this one you'll see has a bit of a more coarse texture. It's going to be a little bit more salt and pepper, a little more salt forward rather than sugar. So they really complement each other well. Let's let that set up while we do the first side of our point here. Same seasoning rundown. Bovine Bold on the bottom. And Yoder beef on top. That's getting nicely set up on that first side, so we can flip this and do the exact same thing with the other side. Now these just need to sit until that rub looks wet on the surface, and then they are ready to go on the smoker. Now let's talk about the actual cooking process, and I'll tell you what we did for our briskets today. Now I actually put a brisket on last night. Before I went to bed, it was about 11 o'clock, and I smoked that at 190 all night long. And in the morning, by the time I actually grabbed it to bring it into work, it was about 10 hours that it had been on there. The bark looked fantastic, and you're gonna see what that looks like here in this video. We're gonna show you exactly how we did that. But for the purpose of what we're doing here today, we're just gonna throw these in with the brisket that's already finishing at 250, and that's gonna make your cook a little bit shorter. So instead of doing a 10-hour overnight cook and then finishing it in the next 2 hours, you may just be doing an 8-hour cook overall. But I've found that for me, the easiest way to get a brisket going is smoke it overnight, wrap it in the morning, and then it can rest as long as you need, and you know it's ready for dinner. Today we're cooking on the Yoder Smokers YS640S pellet grill. We're running the contest mix blend of cherry and pecan pellets. So we're going on the second shelf here. With my flat, I'm gonna put the fat side down for the first part of this cook, just because I poked so many holes in the top of this here. And if I can help keep any of that liquid from coming out, I certainly wanna do that. But when we flip it over, we're actually going to, when we wrap it, we're gonna flip it over is what I meant to say. Which you can see here from these brisket, our point here and our flat that went on last night. And you can see that this has been flipped over, and now we've got that beautiful rendered fat on the top. Right now what I want to do is throw you back to first thing this morning when we wrap these guys up. So this is our point and our flat that's been smoking overnight at 190 degrees for about 10.5 hours now. You can see we've got beautiful bark formation on the surface. That color's amazing. The temperature's sitting at about 165 to 170. So we are ready to go through the wrapping process on these. Let's start with the point. So we're gonna get the point fully wrapped in 2 sheets of heavy duty foil. I'm not adding anything to the wrap. I'm just gonna let it kind of braise in its own juices. This is all gonna get cubed up, tossed in sauce, and finished open on the grill. So I'm really not worried about losing much bark right now. I just wanna make sure I trap a lot of that moisture and flavor in there. And just wrap this as tight as possible. And that can go back on just like that. The flat we're gonna do a little bit differently. For the flat, we're actually going to boat it. And we're gonna do this with the fat side up so that completely trimmed lean meat is underneath. And then we're just going to wrap this foil around it, forming a little barrier at the edges. We're gonna boat it. The advantage of boating it here, this fat can kind of continue to render and you get nice bark on top. But at the same time, you're gonna have the juices coming out of the bottom. They're gonna start to work their way up the edges of the foil. It's gonna braise the bottom, make it nice and tender, keep some of that juice in there, and it helps expedite the cooking process. And this is gonna go back on the grill, and we're gonna turn the temperature up a little bit. Now, since I know that on this specific pellet grill, we're gonna get our best color kind of right where this air exits to go out the stack, I'm gonna leave the boat open right next to the stack, because I'm gonna get some more of that color on the top. The wrapped point we'll put just to the side of that. And then let's throw some probes in, just trying to find that thickest area. Go right for the dead center of the brisket to get an accurate reading. And then over here on our point, I know we've got a thick spot kind of right in here, so I'm just gonna go right through the foil, do the same kind of thing, just halfway through. And now we can monitor those on the app. Been going at 190 all night. We're gonna crank it up to 250. Brisket has been wrapped and on here for another 1.5 hours now. We're checking for doneness. Most of this is gonna be done by feel. There should be not much resistance when probing. If we take a reading, we're probably gonna be, I'm guessing, around 208. Yeah, 209, 210 in some spots. So right now, we need to stop cooking this. We've let the heat out of the packet, which is a good thing, but we want to let it rest a good long while if we can. So I'm just going to loosely wrap this back up and put it into a Cambro or a cooler, whatever you have available to you. Now looking at the flat or our lean meat, boy, look at that fat, the way that's rendering out. That's really pretty. You've got some liquid gathering in the bottom here. This has quite a bit more resistance, so it needs some more time on here. Yeah, we're looking at 193 right now. We'll give that another 10 or 12 degrees, pulling this around 206 or so, depending on the feel. The flat's been wrapped for about 2.5 hours now in that foil boat, which puts us at about 13 hours total cook time. But of course, we went slow with that so we could sleep last night. We certainly could have got it done a little bit faster, but right now it's right where it needs to be. Well, the color's wonderful, but what's really impressive right here is the way this fat's just rendered Got a great crust on it. But man, that's got lots of give. And speaking of which, if we probe this thing throughout, I mean, especially the ends you're gonna find are pure butter. Those always cook a little bit quicker, but even in the thicker parts right in the middle, very little resistance, and we're temping at about 208 in the thickest parts. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take this off and rest it also in the Cambro or in a cooler. You gotta give this at least an hour before you slice into it. But it can hold hot in there for much longer. This point has had a good long time to rest, and now we're gonna cube it up to turn it into burnt ends. So I'll typically come in here, cut my strips first, kind of all go in the same direction. This slice is so much easier when you've given it a good rest. If we try to do this hot, it's just falling apart. And then we're gonna take those pieces and we just wanna cube them up. Again, because we've separated this out and cooked it separate from the flat, we've got bark on both sides of every single one of these juicy burnt ends. Flavor, smoke, bark. Check out that smoke ring right there. I mean, that tells you all you need to know. But this is gonna be maximum flavor on burnt ends. So our burnt ends are gonna go back in the foil now. We gotta get some sweetness on these. They've got a great salty smokiness going on from the rub. Just really mild sweet. So we're gonna add some Smoke on Wheels KC bootleg barbecue sauce. This is a really unique sauce. It's made out of Kansas City, but it's got some cool stuff in it like Dr. Pepper. Got a little bourbon in it as well. So we want this all in one layer so it can all take on the heat to tack up the sauce. This is gonna go back onto the grill at 300 just briefly. While those burnt ends finish up, we're gonna slice into the lean meat here. If you check out your bottom side, it's pretty easy to tell where those muscle fibers are running, and you wanna go opposite those. So we're gonna be cutting this direction. Let's go ahead and come right through the middle for this first one. Take a look. Oh, wow. That's pretty nice and juicy considering that we separated this and took it away from that fat and moisture source that was that decal that runs in between the two muscles. I love how the top's nice and sticky. That fat renders to the point where it just makes that sticky sound. And these slices are looking nice and tender. Yeah, if anything, just a touch over, but still a nice tug to it. That little fat layer on top makes all the difference. Now the ends always tend to be a little bit over, like they want to kind of shred apart. I'll try and cut a nice slice and we'll see if I can mess it up. This is what I'm talking about. And that's totally fine because I've actually got a plan for this. You guys can pretty soon be expecting a brisket mac and cheese video, and this right here is exactly what we're going to use for it. Those end pieces that just kind of fall apart anyway. So here you got your smoke ring peeking through that fat. You can see it on the bottom as well. You see a little discoloration here and there, and what that is that's that injection that we put in there. So that's really the only trade-off from adding a dark colored injection, is that every once in a while you'll see where it was inserted into the meat. But it's totally worth the trade-off because of the moisture that you get out of it. Now, I'm not a huge fan of sauce on brisket, but if you're gonna use one, this KC Crossroads is where it's at. It's not a super sweet barbecue sauce, but as you can see, obviously tomato based with that bright red color. This is a really great complement to beef, especially when you don't want it to be overly sweet. So I really don't mind if we've got it just painted on one side like we're doing today. Otherwise, just put it on the side and let people dip. So this is what about 20 to 30 minutes looks like. That sauce is really tacked up on our burn ends. Let's get them off of here and have a taste. All right, here we go. Man, the sauce really balances it out. It's got just the right amount of sweetness to the salt. This is what I love about Kansas City barbecue. You don't get all one note. It's not bland. It's a little bit creative, but it's got great balance of flavors. And these burn-ins in particular today are spot on. Not falling apart, but melting in my mouth. Love it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out atbbq.com for all the products featured in today's video. If you enjoy the recipe, hit that subscribe button. And if you have any questions or comments, or there's anything you'd like to see me cook, let me know in the comment section down below, and let's be good to one another. For more recipes, tips, and techniques, head over to atbbq.com/thesauce. All things barbecue, where barbecue legends are made.